go through straight again. And what we do now is close-ups of your fingers and your face and everything. So.
It won't be the same thing I'm playing, you know, so if you edit it, it'll jump badly, you realise that, do you? I won't play the same thing.
It'll be similar, won't it?
No, I forgot it already.
It'll be similar. When you're ready.
I'm going to play it again?
Yeah, please, sorry.
Fine.
Okay, maestro. So about the last 20 seconds or something, I think along them lines. Okay, yeah. I mean, the music side of it was fine. The acting, it's the camera what she's talking about. I'm still recording, so off we go. We'll do it once more because of the move.
Basically, I prefer you to go before he puts the trumpet down.
Right, okay.
And then you make the move slightly slower. The playing's brilliant, Rod.
Right.
I'm just trying to get the shot right. That's all.
Trying to get the cameraman to do his job properly. I'm recording again.
ashes are?
I'm sure, in my own mind, that his ashes are behind the plaque on the wall behind us. My reasons for that are mainly that Joe Denise, my dear friend, now passed away, who was Ken's guitar player, told me that he'd been here, when I brought him here on one occasion, to a funeral. He said, I came here to a funeral, not a memorial service. And furthermore, when the sun is in the south and you stand rascally fashion on the beautiful oak bench there, you can see behind the panel, and I have made out the outlines of a casket in a niche behind the panel.
Now, when you were the former art master here, you used to come and practice in here for hours. I mean, any free period that you would get.
I'm glad you're telling me now and not when I was actually here.
Can you tell me why you used to come and practice playing your trumpet here?
Well, a trumpet player has to keep their lip in, you know, otherwise it can be very embarrassing when you get on the stand and miss high C's and things. And as this chapel was peaceful and quiet, and as I had a small but very knowledgeable audience on the wall there, it was an ideal place to practice.
What did you think of Snakehips' music? Snakehips really swing.
Ken Johnson, in my opinion, led the most swinging and the most jazzy orchestra of the 1930s in Britain. That may be contentious, but that's my opinion.
Had he lived, would he... I mean, his rise was meteoric, I take it, in the time he was alive and leading the band. Had he lived, do you think he would have gone on to greater things?
Yes, I think so, and I think Britain would have had an orchestra, not exactly to rival the great American bands, but it would have been certainly better able to rival the Americans when they started to come over in the 1950s than the bands we actually had. They had to learn from the Americans in a way that hadn't been possible before.
What do you think the reason is behind his... I mean, it was a pretty incredible, fast rise to fame. I mean, what's behind that?
Well, it's always hard to tell why somebody shoots to fame, I think, particularly when they do it very quickly. But I think his orchestra was different. I think a lot of the, if I dare use the word white, orchestras of the West End sound a little bit samey. They may have had an exceptional jazz soloist, Nat Ganella's name springs to mind, but I think they sounded fairly European, and Ken's band didn't. It sounded more like the real jazz of America, and that, of course the gimmick of having an all-black band might have also helped.
Right. Do you think, I mean, given the fact that he was Britain's first established black band leader, and given the fact of his early death, I mean, do you think it's sad that, in a way, a lot of people, the nation doesn't remember him, and his ashes could be here behind that plaque, and it's quite a small measure of remembrance. Do you think that's sad?
Well, I think it's sad in a way that he died. In one sense, of course, you could say that it was the most romantic and fitting death for a band leader to be bombed as he's actually conducting the band. On the other hand, had he lived, Britain might have been in a much more advanced state, if I can use that word. It might have had a band in the early 50s that was more jazzy, with more blues feeling than we actually had. I don't want to insult the fine bands we had, but I do think that in 1956, when Count Basie brought his band over, we all had quite a shock. The shock may not have been as big if Ken had lived.
What do you think Britain lost when Ken died?
Just that. I think when Ken died, we lost a potential American standard big band. It might be possible to have one now, but we could have had it in 1940, and we could have had it all the way through the 40s and 50s and the 60s. Maybe the Beatles would never have happened.
So do you think his death stunted the musical development in this country?
I think it delayed it. I wouldn't say initially stunted, and I must emphasise that there were fine players and fine orchestras. Lou Stone, Geraldo, there were many fine West End orchestras, and I wouldn't want to demean them at all. Magnificent orchestras, but on jazziness and bluesiness, we were behind. And Ken might have dragged us along a bit quicker.
What would have happened if Ken had lived? And in your opinion, was he the best swing band around?
Well, of course, it's hard to be sure about what might have happened had Ken lived. But if he'd lived and carried on band leading, I think we would have had an American quality in the sense of jazziness and swinging and blues feeling. We would have had a band, I think, approaching American quality throughout the 40s and 50s, and maybe in the 60s and 70s, or even later, and it might just have headed off the Beatles and Company Limited.
And in your opinion, was he the best swing band around?
Well, in terms of jazziness and blues feeling and swing, I think it's almost unarguable that he was in advance of the magnificent white bands of the West End in the 30s.
So he was pretty magnificent then?
It was a very good band, a very jazzy band.
And can you just go over the question for me again? Why did you come and practice here, and why do you think his ashes are behind that flag?
I used to practice here when I was schoolmastering in 3 periods, and I came because of the peaceful chapel, civilised carvings and oak panelling, and because I knew I had an audience of 1 at least to keep me on my toes.
A fellow jazzer.
Dear old Ken on the wall there.
I'll ask you that again so you can get it on all in one. Can you tell me why you used to come and practice here, and who was your audience?
I used to practice here when I was schoolmastering in 3 lessons. Of course, you have to keep your lip in if you're a trumpet player. It's always difficult, even for the hard pros who are on the road all the time. Here I had a chapel, a rehearsal room, a little bit set away from the school, so I wasn't bothering the kids, and I had a very shrewd audience on the wall behind me there, Ken.
And why do you think he's behind his ashes?
I think his ashes there because Joe Denise, my dear friend, now passed away, who was the guitarist with Ken's band, told me that he came here to a funeral, not to a service of remembrance. And furthermore, if you stand, rascally fashion, on the lovely oak pews and peer behind the panel, when the sun is perfectly in the south, it shines behind the panel and you can see a casket in a recess. So Ken's there all right. I haven't been talking to him in vain.